is the gravest threat to European security in decades. 5,358 have been killed, 12,235 have been wounded since April 2014. 224 civilians have been killed and 545 civilians have been wounded in just the past 3 weeks. Those are civilians. If allowed, this aggression continues unimpeded. Moscow may feel emboldened to challenge the integrity of the NATO alliance. That's why the United States and our NATO allies must deter further Russian aggression by providing defensive lethal assistance to Moscow. Let me dispense with the inevitable straw man. Defensive lethal assistance will not allow the Ukrainian military to defeat the Russian military in a full-fledged war, but it will raise the risks and costs Russia must incur to continue its offensive. It will pierce the veneer of the Kremlin's cynical and false narrative that there are no Russians in Ukraine. As we saw last year, the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers have protested the increasing number of Russian troops that are not coming home from their, quote, routine deployments. Vladimir Putin can only hide the truth for so long, and the truth, more than any sanction, will vindicate the fundamental principle that every sovereign nation has the right to defend itself. That's what Ukraine seeks, not American forces to do its fighting, but that our nation open once again the arsenal of democracy that has allowed free peoples to defend themselves. And here in the United States, and here today, is broad bipartisan consensus that it's time we do just that. I will conclude with the words of a report issued this month by the Brookings Institute, the Atlantic Council, and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, authored by, among others, Michelle Flournoy, Admiral James Stavridis, and 2 former ambassadors to Ukraine. And I quote, "Assisting Ukraine to deter attack and defend itself is not inconsistent with the search for a peaceful political solution. It is essential to achieving it. Only if the Kremlin knows that the risks and costs of further military action are high will it seek to find an acceptable political solution." I want to thank my friends who are here today, who have been involved and care about these people who are far away in a distant land, who are being slaughtered as we speak by an individual who seeks to restore the Russian Empire. United, we believe we are speaking for the overwhelming majority of the American people. Senator Reid.
Well, today I join Chairman McCain and my Senate colleagues in calling for additional military assistance for Ukraine to help their forces defend their country. The administration has committed to provide nearly $120 million in military assistance to Ukraine to date, all in the form of non-lethal aid. Ukrainian forces have fought courageously to defend their country, but the events of the past few weeks have demonstrated that Russia continues to violate its commitments and escalate its aggression against Ukraine. In the past few days, separatists in eastern Ukraine, with substantial Russian equipment, training, and leadership, have abandoned any pretext of a ceasefire and launched a broad offensive against Ukrainian forces. We should be prepared to help Ukraine to defend itself against this aggression. In the fiscal year 2015 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress overwhelmingly supported providing the Ukraine lethal and non-lethal military assistance that is defensive and non-provocative in nature so that Ukraine can defend its territory and sovereignty from further aggression. Such defensive weapons could include anti-tank weapons and counter-battery radar systems. Building Ukraine's capability to defend itself would raise the cost of further Russian-backed aggression and bolster deterrence of any new offensive. The United States should not undertake this effort alone and should work with willing allies and partners to aid Ukraine. At the same time, we should make it clear to the Ukrainians that while we support their commitment to defend themselves, they cannot expect U.S. combat forces to come to their aid in the fight. Our additional assistance to Ukraine should be provided consistent with clear objectives, including restoring the ceasefire as agreed at Minsk, supporting the efforts of the Poroshenko government to negotiate a political settlement with regional leaders in eastern Ukraine, and maintaining a commitment to the medium and long-term reform of the Ukrainian security forces. Taking these steps will send an important signal. It will signal support to the Ukrainians for their efforts to defend themselves. It will hopefully give the Russians and the Russian-backed separatists pause regarding any thoughts of further escalation or violations of their commitments to find a political resolution of the crisis. And it will signal resolve to our allies who are concerned about being the next victims of Russian aggression. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll make this real brief. I was honored to be in Ukraine during their election in November, and that's people in this country don't seem to understand. I sat there, I looked at Poroshenko, I looked at Yatsenyuk, and there are two different political parties, both of them very strong pro-West. And so see the looks on their faces when they realized and they counted the votes. In order to get a seat in Parliament, you have to have 5%. This is the first time in 96 years that the communists don't have one seat in Parliament. This is no way to treat a good friend.
Senator Nelson.
I met with all the government in Ukraine last August and spoke out then that we should give lethal assistance. Interestingly, the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Defense Minister, what they requested at that point was they wanted up-to-the-minute intelligence and they wanted training. And we have provided those. But that's not enough when you're facing the Russian bear. And we simply cannot let Vladimir Putin get away with invading another sovereign country as he has already taken Crimea, part of Ukraine. This is what we should do, lethal assistance.
Senator Graham.
This is the Senate at its best. This is what the United States Senate should be doing more of, coming together when it makes sense to change the world for the better. I hope this will lead to other breakthroughs on other issues. To my colleagues who stand here in a bipartisan fashion, you're standing for the best traditions of our nation. What is this not? This is not a fight between two friends that we should not take sides. This is not a fight between two friends. This is a fight between a struggling democracy and an autocratic dictatorship, and we should take sides. We should always be on the side of struggling democracies, and we should always stand up to people like Putin because it makes us safer. It's the right thing to do. Why do we want to help the Ukrainian military? The Russian puppet destroyed the Ukrainian military. Russia, through Ukrainian agents, destroyed the ability of this country to defend itself. It is up to those who believe in struggling democracies to stand up and be counted and to do the very basic thing that's required of a friend. Give you the tools to help yourself. Not one person is suggesting we send American soldiers into the Ukraine. We're all saying we've got a struggling democracy, a friend in the making. They need our help, and we're not going to let Putin tell us what to do. Finally, helping a friend somewhere makes friends of America everywhere feel better. Standing up to a dictator somewhere may have the benefit of influencing dictators everywhere.
First of all, my thanks to Senator McCain for his leadership and to Senator Reid and to all of my colleagues. I think truly this picture is worth 1,000 words, at least 1,000 of my words. What we have here is colleagues coming together on a very bipartisan basis for our national interest. Make no mistake, sanctions are not working. Ukrainians are being slaughtered, and we have a role to play in imposing restraint. And our credibility is at stake and at risk as well. It's not only Ukrainian interests that are at risk here, but also American security interests. We need to see that Putin understands nothing but force. He is a thug. He has not responded to sanctions. Sanctions are not working. And the robust and muscular approach that we are urging now, in fact, was authorized by Congress in the last session, $350 million in military and defensive aid, which includes the kinds of weapons, anti-tank missiles, that are vital for the Ukrainians to defend themselves against Russian troops that have invaded their country. That's the simple, plain, blunt truth, and the United States has to respond in kind. Thank you.
I want to thank Senators McCain and Reid and all of my colleagues on this incredibly important issue. Last April, I had the privilege of traveling with Senator Donnelly to Ukraine, and at that time, we had both called on a bipartisan basis for providing lethal assistance for Ukraine to defend itself. And then again, being there in the May presidential elections, this is, I agree with Senator Blumenthal, about our credibility. We signed, as did Ukraine, as did Russia, the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for assurances about its security. Russia violated that law. In fact, as I look at Vladimir Putin, he is the schoolyard bully, and he's picking on the smaller member of the class. And it's time to provide Ukraine the ability to defend itself. So I'm so glad that we've come together on a bipartisan basis to do this. It is past time due that we allow defensive weapons to the Ukrainian people so that they can defend themselves against this blatant Russian aggression and invasion of their country. If we can't stand together on this, what credibility will we have with any ally around the world? And I think all of us together on a bipartisan basis, and what we've heard in the Armed Services Committee, we've heard secretaries of state, former, who have both have served under Democrat and Republican administrations tell us the same thing. There seems to be a consensus, and now we need the president to take action and to provide defensive arms to the Ukrainian people.
I want to thank Chairman McCain and Ranking Member Reid. This is not only a whole committee together as a bipartisan group, but a whole Senate as a bipartisan group and a whole Congress. As Senator Ayotte mentioned, she and I were in Ukraine a year ago, and at that time we called for defensive lethal weapons for Ukraine. And the need is only more urgent now. We not only met with the Prime Minister at the time, but we walked the streets. And when we were walking down the streets, people came up to us, handed us Ukrainian flags, and said, "You're our friends, you're our hope, can you stand with us?" And that's what we're doing today. This is a nation that is our friend, that is a sovereign nation, and that has been attacked. And this is the least we can do. And so we stand together to send the message to the people of Ukraine: we will stand with you, we will help, and we will help you protect your independence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Reid. It's great to be here with my colleagues on an issue that we all agree upon. Many years ago, I was very fortunate and had the privilege of attending an agricultural exchange in Ukraine while it was still part of the former Soviet Union. And we lived, the Iowa students and myself lived on a collective farm for a number of weeks. And in the evening, when the community members came together, we did not talk about agricultural practices as I anticipated. What we talked about was what it was like to be free and what it was like to be an American. Those are the things that the Ukrainians wanted to know. They wanted to know about freedom and democracy. And just a few short years later, they became an independent nation. They are a sovereign nation. They are an ally. And so I am in full agreement that we do need to provide lethal assistance to our friends in Ukraine, to President Poroshenko, to push back on aggression coming from President Putin and Russia. So I would encourage all of you to take this word, show that we are moving as a unified Congress, and asking that we provide lethal assistance to our allies. The world will determine if we are friends to our allies around the world, and also, in the same token, protecting our own national security interests. So again, Chairman, thank you. Senator Reid, thank you for allowing us to be here today. Thank you.
I also would like to thank Chairman McCain and Ranking Member Reid. I think this is a great example of what happens when you step forward and you look at a situation and you put it in some very simple terms. We have some issues in this Senate that there's just shades of gray. There are others in which the resolve and the decision-making is a little bit easier. This one is one of the easier decisions to make. And that decision is to support an ally. And as Senator Ayotte had suggested, sometimes a bully has to be confronted. If we allow the Ukrainians the opportunity to punch the bully in the nose, maybe he thinks twice about what the cost of aggression truly is. This is our opportunity to stand with our allies, but it's also an opportunity to send a message to Mr. Putin that the Ukraine is not the border of Russia anymore. It is Ukraine, a country that stands as a sovereign nation. Thank you.
The President's refusal to provide defensive lethal weaponry to Ukraine over the last year has greatly increased the risk of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East and in East Asia. In 1994, in exchange for Ukraine surrendering its nuclear weapons, the United States and other allies guaranteed its territorial integrity. Ukraine believed us, but we haven't kept that promise. If today Ukraine had nuclear weapons on its soil, it would not have Russian troops on its soil. What kind of message are we sending to Iran as they continue their race towards nuclear weapons? What kind of message are we sending to our allies in the Middle East about the trustworthiness of American promises? It's time for America to keep its promise, to support our friends, and to hurt our enemies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Reid. You know, as a freshman, it's great to see such a bipartisan effort on a real critical national security issue. The only additional point I want to make is, as a country, we have a lot to offer Ukraine and our allies when they're in need. We're talking about weapons here, and that's important, but we also have the great opportunity to offer them energy. And in terms of long-term security for the Ukrainians who have been blackmailed by the Russians with regard to energy and gas, America's ability to export energy, whether it's gas or other energy, to our allies is a great opportunity to help them. And I think that's something we also need to be looking at in terms of this Congress to help our allies like Ukraine.
Could I just finally say, 2 days in a row, this committee and Republicans and Democrats have come together on an issue of national security. Yesterday it was about the weapons that the King of Jordan and his country needs in order to defend themselves and to respond to the horrible event that took place as far as the Jordanian pilot is concerned. Today, we joined together in a bipartisan effort to provide relief to the suffering people of Ukraine. Questions?
What's the practical result of this? Is there legislation afoot? Are you just asking the White House to timely act, or are you going to?
We're asking in a bipartisan fashion, but we'll be looking up at marking up legislation that calls for it again.
Opposed to sending arms to Ukraine. How would it feel for the U.S. to send lethal assistance despite European opposition?
Well, first of all, I'm hopeful that the Germans, under German leadership, that the Europeans will come around and be much more active in support of Ukraine. Frankly, I'm not overly optimistic as long as they are dependent on Russian energy, and they've been a huge disappointment to me. Their actions recently have been reminiscent of the 1930s, but we will continue to hope.
Let me just emphasize 2 points that have been made by my colleagues. First, on a unanimous or bipartisan basis in the last defense bill, we authorized this shipment of defensive lethal weapons to Ukraine, and we're just simply reiterating that today. Second, I think the hope of all of us is that this step will re-energize the political process, and that there will be a respect for the ceasefire, and also help to the President of the Ukraine to deal with the political issues. And I think those 2 points have to be emphasized.
Yes.
If you write new legislation, are you going to revise the type of equipment that you think is most critically needed for the Ukraine?
I don't think we need to get that specific. Everybody knows what they need. Right now, they have no ability to counter a Russian tank. That really makes for wholesale slaughter when you cannot defend against Russian tanks which have flowed in from Russia into the separatist area.
On an unrelated topic, Pelosi just said over on the House side that an AUMF is expected in the coming days again on the campaign against ISIS. I know you've been in talks with the White House. I think some of the rest of you have as well. Have you heard anything from the White House on that?
I've just heard that it may be coming, but I've been hearing that for some months. I don't know if Jack.
I've been hearing that it's imminent.
Any more?
Yeah, Senators, I mean, some of what you're talking about here is starting to sound a little bit like the old sort of proxy war between Russia and the United States. I'm wondering if you have any concerns about escalations, and also it sounds like a fairly substantial investment in terms of cost. Do you address either of those?
Well, first of all, there was the belief that if we did not provide defensive weapons to Ukraine, then things would eventually be okay. And we didn't want to, quote, provoke Vladimir Putin. Well, obviously, Vladimir Putin has not gotten that message. The separatist leader just reneged on the Minsk agreement, what was left of it, and over a break period, General Breedlove, our head of NATO, indicated there was significant movement of Russian arms, equipment, and people into Ukraine. We're frankly at the end of the line here. You just can't stand by and watch people being slaughtered with superior equipment. Blankets don't do very well against tanks. So some of us believe, maybe not all of us, but we all are united in this belief, but that the price, as a number of my colleagues said, that Putin might pay for further aggression might be the deterrent that we're looking for. If he thinks he's getting away, literally with murder, then I think he may be encouraged to do so. Finally, history shows that when dictators have domestic difficulties, as clearly the Russians have today, quite often they are more likely to commit outside aggression than they otherwise would have been, obviously to divert the attention of their population.
Also, just on the cost, do you have a cap on what the country should be willing to spend to do this sort of arming, and how long it should last?
I have no idea.
Well, I think the key here is to give the Ukrainians the ability to defend their territory and also to move back to a political solution. That's the key. The Ukrainians are calling up more troops. They are determined to protect their sovereignty and their nation. And we hope that with this support, they can do that, and ultimately this will be a political solution that will be between the parties who are now contesting each other.
Anybody else?
Could I also add, too, I think the other consideration we have to take into account here is how our allies feel in the Baltics. And so if Putin feels that he can move without any consequences, because clearly the sanctions aren't stopping him, then what's his next step? And I know there's a lot of fear in the area, and that is very costly. Not only do we want him to respect the sovereignty of Ukraine, but of all of the countries in that region, and they're very concerned about it, our allies there. And so it's very important that we do this not only for Ukraine, but for our allies in the region.
When I left the Ukraine, I went to Lithuania and met with the president. And it's exactly what Senator Ayotte has said. They are scared to death because not only is Russia right on their border, they also have substantial Russian-speaking populations in each of their countries. And so what they fear is the kind of head fake that Putin used in eastern Ukraine, using the Russian-speaking population as an excuse to come in because of some trumped-up charge that they were being discriminated against in that particular country. And the fear is very real in the Baltics.
So you had asked about the cost, and Senator Ayotte mentioned the Budapest Memorandum. We gave our word. And what is the cost if we don't keep our word? That we will be there to protect our friend. And that brings us to what Senator Nelson was just saying, is that everybody in the region is scared to death, is afraid of what Vladimir Putin is going to do. And if at some point we don't stand up for our friends, I think it will only get worse.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, as always.
Thank you, sir.